Have you ever witnessed a moment where in just a few seconds, a person's dignity was dragged to the floor just because someone else thought they didn't belong there? And you wondered, if that person was you, how would you stand up? On a late-night flight from San Francisco to New York, a black woman dressed modestly, quiet, and exhausted from her long workdays was dragged from her first-class seat. No screaming, no resistance, just a look of pain but strangely calm. No one knew that the passenger was the co-founder of the airline that she was being humiliated by, right on her own brainchild. That day, the story was not just about the chair. It was about choosing between silence or standing up, between resignation or reclaiming dignity, between letting others define you or rewriting your own story. If it were you, amidst the judgmental looks, amidst the unfounded suspicions, amidst the pain of being looked down upon, what would you do? Would you keep silent, or would you step over your fear to protect yourself? This is not just one story. This is a wound shared by so many people, people who have been judged because of their appearance, or the color of their skin, or because they are quiet. And it is also the story of a woman who chose to stand up, not to retaliate, but to change an entire system. If you want to hear the whole powerful journey, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel to join in every emotional moment of the story. The cabin lights glowed in a soft amber hue, the kind of warm tone airlines used to signal that everything was under control. It was the last hour of daylight over San Francisco, and inside Liberty Air Flight 91, first class was unusually quiet. No chatter, no clinking glasses, just the low hum of air recycling through the vents and the faint scent of brewed coffee drifting from the galley. Ava Morgan eased into seat 1 Alpha, the window seat she had always loved, the seat she had once helped design when Liberty Air was still trying to reinvent itself. It had taken months of sketches, testing rounds, and endless debates about lumbar support and recline angles. And even now, 8 years later, the moment Ava sank into it, she felt an odd sense of ownership, like sliding back into a familiar memory. She exhaled, a long, tired breath that came from somewhere deeper than her lungs. 14 days on the road in Tokyo, Seoul, and Singapore had drained her far more than she wanted to admit. She wasn't 25 anymore. At 42, her body complained louder, and her mind carried weight that didn't used to be there. She pushed the hood of her gray sweatshirt off her head and rubbed her thumb along the edge of a paper cup. She'd picked up a medium latte on the walk through the terminal, but the foam had already collapsed. It didn't matter. The warmth in her hands was comfort enough. The world outside the window was all concrete and taxiing planes, engines howling in the distance. But here inside the first-class cabin, the world felt slowed down, contained, quiet. And for the first time that entire week, Ava allowed herself to relax. She pulled her old leather backpack closer, making sure it fit snugly against the footwell. She always traveled with the same backpack, faded brown, with scuffed corners and a broken zipper pull she'd fixed with a paperclip years ago. It wasn't stylish, it wasn't designer, but it had been with her through every crisis, every negotiation, every overnight airport layover where she'd slept upright in an uncomfortable chair. She trusted it more than she trusted most people. The overhead bin clicked shut with a soft thud, and Ava instinctively looked up. A passenger across the aisle, a middle-aged white man in a crisp button-down, was staring at her. Not the casual glance people give when noticing a fellow traveler. This was different. His eyes lingered too long, traveling from the hoodie, to the plain jeans, to her battered sneakers. Then came the look, the one she had learned to interpret over a lifetime. A look that asked a question without speaking. Why are you sitting here? Ava had seen it in boardrooms, at fundraising dinners, in hotel lobbies during tech conferences, and now, here in first class. Again. The man quickly looked away as soon as she met his eyes. But the moment was enough to stir something in her chest, a small, familiar ache. She turned back toward the window and pressed her palm lightly against the narrow armrest. She whispered to herself, barely audible, "It's fine. Just breathe." The soft ding of the boarding announcement filled the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, we are continuing to board Liberty Air Flight 91 with service to New York City. Please, have your boarding passes ready. Ava pulled the hood back over her head. She didn't want to be recognized. Sometimes people knew who she was, sometimes they didn't. But she'd learned to prefer anonymity. When people knew she was the co-founder and chief innovation officer of Liberty Air, the energy changed. Conversations became awkward. Flight attendants got flustered. Some passengers tried too hard to impress her, while others blamed her for anything they didn't like about the airline. Today, she wanted nothing more than 5 uninterrupted hours of silence. She pulled out a small paperback book, a dog-eared copy of a novel she'd been trying to finish for months. She opened it to page 93, but the words blurred. Her mind was too full, too tired. She thought of the meeting in Tokyo, the one that had stretched past midnight. She thought of the morning she'd barely woken up in time for her flight to Seoul. She thought of her mother's voice on the phone 2 nights earlier, soft with worry. "You need rest, baby. You push yourself too hard." Ava smiled faintly at the memory. "Maybe after this quarter," she had told her mother. But even as she said it, she knew it was a lie. Another wave of passengers entered first class. Their roller bags clacked against the carpeted aisle. Perfume, cologne, a child's laughter drifting from economy. The movement, the noise, they all blended into a gentle, familiar chaos. A tall woman in a navy business suit brushed past Ava's seat. A man in expensive loafers followed. A couple holding hands whispered excitedly as they moved toward the last row of first class. And then, the energy changed. It hit Ava before she even looked up. A scent sharp, floral, the kind worn by people who like to be noticed. The rhythm of heels striking the floor, confident, impatient, and a voice piercing through the calm like a blade. "Excuse me, can someone help me with this bag? It's ridiculous we have to do everything ourselves now." Ava didn't move. She didn't need to. She already knew trouble had arrived. The woman stepped into the aisle, blocking the soft cabin lights for a moment. She had perfectly styled blonde hair, a tailored emerald blazer, diamond studs that glinted under the overhead light. Her makeup was sharp enough to cut glass. Whitney Caldwell, a name Ava didn't know yet, but a presence she recognized instantly. Whitney scanned the cabin with the entitlement of someone who believed the world owed her convenience. Her gaze flicked to each passenger and then inevitably landed on Ava. A slow, puzzled frown pulled at her lips. She stared and stared and didn't look away. Ava felt her heartbeat shift a single heavy thud. She kept her face neutral, but her fingers curled slightly around her book. Whitney took one step closer. Her voice lowered, but not enough to hide the condescension. "Are you sure this is your seat?" A familiar sting rose in Ava's chest. Not anger. Not yet. Just a tired, weary ache. She considered ignoring the woman. But her upbringing, her dignity, her strength, they didn't allow that. So she lifted her eyes, calm as still water. "Yes, I'm sure." Whitney blinked. Once, twice, as if she couldn't quite process the idea. Before she could respond, a flight attendant approached. A young man with a bright smile and hurried movements. His name tag read, Ethan. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked Whitney. Whitney pointed at Ava, still staring. "I think she's in the wrong seat." Ava closed her book. "Here we go again." Ethan Clark stood between the two women, his smile faltering just slightly. He didn't mean to look uncomfortable, but something in Whitney Caldwell's gaze made him straighten his posture, as if reporting to a superior officer. "She's in my seat," Whitney repeated, slower this time, as if each word carried its own weight. Ava Morgan closed her book with a soft thud. The cabin was quiet enough that she heard the faint rustle of someone shifting in the row behind her. eyes were watching. They always watched openly or discreetly whenever situations like this began to unfold. It was human nature, she supposed. Nobody wanted trouble, but people rarely stepped in to stop it. Ava lifted her boarding pass from the pocket sewn into her hoodie, digital, clean, glowing softly on her lock screen, seat 1A. She held it up without defensiveness, just clarity. "This is my seat," she said quietly. Ethan leaned closer to look. His eyebrows lifted for a brief moment, surprise, hesitation, but then something shifted in his expression, a subtle calculation, a weighing of appearances. A young worker, making a quick judgment in the face of competing pressures. Whitney gave an impatient sigh. "No offense," she said, a phrase people only used when they were absolutely being offensive, but first class is assigned carefully. There's usually a certain expectation for who sits here. Ava felt something cold settle in the center of her chest. She'd heard versions of this her entire life, at colleges, job interviews, tech conferences, charity galas, places where people expected a certain type, and that type was never her. Still, she didn't rise to it. She breathed slow. In, out. A gentle steadiness returned to her voice. "Expectation doesn't override assignment," Ava replied. "And this is my assigned seat." Whitney blinked, forcing a smile so tight it strained the muscles in her face. "You must have mistaken your row," she said. "This happens sometimes." Ava didn't respond. She didn't need to. The boarding pass in her hand spoke for itself. But Whitney wasn't done. "You know what?" Whitney said, turning to Ethan as if Ava were no longer present. "Just verify her ticket. I've flown this route every month for the past 6 years. I always sit in 1 Alpha or 1 Delta. I don't know how this mix-up happened, but I'm sure we can fix it." Ethan nodded, a reflex more than a decision. "Of course, ma'am. Let me check." He didn't ask Whitney for her boarding pass. He didn't check the manifest. He didn't even pause to consider the simplest solution. Look at the seating chart. Instead, he turned his full attention to Ava. "I'm going to need you to step out of your seat for a moment," Ethan said, "just so we can sort this out." Ava blinked slowly. There it was. The shift. The moment a simple misunderstanding became something else. Her hand tightened around the paperback in her lap, its worn edges pressed gently into her fingers. She studied Ethan's face. He wasn't cruel, he wasn't even confident. He looked unsure, maybe overwhelmed. And behind that uncertainty was fear. Fear of offending a passenger who exuded power, money, and complaint potential. Ava could almost feel the tug-of-war inside him. She'd seen it before, so many times. Not deliberate malice, just the ease of siding with comfort over confrontation. "I'm comfortable here," Ava said softly, "and I've shown you my boarding pass. It's valid. There's no mistake to fix." Whitney scoffed. "Oh, come on. This is ridiculous. She's clearly—" Ava met her gaze, steady and unblinking. Whitney fell silent, but only for half a beat. Ethan cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I'm not asking you to move permanently. Just stand up so we can double-check everything." A thought flickered through Ava's mind. Not angry, not hurt, just tired. How many times do I have to prove I belong? She knew how these situations played out. If she moved, even briefly, the narrative would shift. She'd become the unassigned passenger, the confused customer. The problem? Ava had spent her entire life refusing to let people rewrite her place in the world simply because her presence disrupted their expectations. So she spoke with calm clarity, a voice that held its ground without raising its volume. "I'm not standing up," she said. "And there's no reason to double-check anything. You haven't even looked at her ticket." Whitney gasped. "Are you accusing me of lying?" Ava's face remained serene. "I'm saying we should follow the same procedure for everyone." The man across the aisle quietly opened the Notes app on his phone. Ava caught the movement in her peripheral vision. Another passenger straightened in his seat, Someone farther back stopped the tapping on their laptop keyboard. The tension in the cabin thickened like humidity before a storm. Ethan's jaw tightened. Not in anger, more in the way someone braces themselves before jumping into cold water. He gave a stiff nod. "Let me check with the gate supervisor," he said. "Just wait here." He turned and hurried down the aisle. Whitney stood perfectly still for a moment, lips thin with annoyance. Then she leaned closer to Ava, lowering her voice. "You don't have to make this harder," she hissed. "This is probably a mistake. Why don't you just be reasonable?" Ava looked out the window instead of at Whitney. The tarmac lights flickered faintly against the growing dusk. A ground crew member walked by with reflective gear flashing in the light. The world outside felt wide and calm. The world inside her seat felt tight and suffocating. She inhaled slowly, letting the breath fill her chest before she answered. "I am being reasonable," she said. "I'm simply staying in the seat I paid for." Whitney's nostrils flared. She opened her mouth, ready to launch another volley, but a voice from behind interrupted. "Everything all right up here?" The tone was neutral but edged with curiosity. Ava turned slightly. A man in his late 30s, seated in row 2, watched the exchange with cautious concern. He wasn't filming, he wasn't taking notes, he just looked unsettled. Whitney plastered on a fake smile. "No issues," she chirped, though her voice was tight. "Just making sure this young lady hasn't been misplaced." Young lady, a phrase that sounded polite but wasn't. A phrase used when someone tried to speak down from a pedestal. Ava let the words pass without reaction, though they hit the same old bruise inside her. Ethan returned, walking a little too fast. Behind him was a man in a polo shirt with a Liberty Air badge clipped to his belt. His name tag read, Mason Lee Gate Supervisor. Mason wore the expression of someone who had 100 tasks waiting and didn't want one more. He approached with an authoritative stride, addressing Whitney first, not Ava. "Ma'am," he said with a courteous nod, "how can I assist you?" Whitney pointed at Ava again. "She's in my seat." A small, tension-like click echoed in Ava's mind. Not anger, just the realization that the script was playing out exactly as she feared. Mason turned to Ava. "Ma'am, could I see your boarding pass?" Ava handed over her phone without hesitation. Mason scanned it. The screen reflected briefly on his face. Seat 1A. Boarded in Group 1. Fully valid. No duplicates. He frowned, slightly confused. Whitney crossed her arms. "Well, what does it say?" Before Mason could respond, Whitney shoved her own paper boarding pass toward him. "See? 1 Alpha. Like always." But it wasn't. Mason's eyes flicked between the two passes. His brows lifted, then lowered. His jaw tensed. Whitney's pass read, Seat 3D. Not close. Not a mistake. Not a printing error. Ava watched the subtle shift on Mason's face. A flicker of truth. A flicker of discomfort. A flicker of decision-making. But then something in him hardened. A shift. A quiet surrender to the path of least resistance. He took a small step back and squared his shoulders. "I'm going to need you to step off the aircraft for further verification," Mason said to Ava. The words landed like a blow. The passengers went still. Even Whitney froze for a second, surprised by how quickly Mason took her side. Ava's hand trembled slightly, though she didn't lift it. A soft pulse beat at her temple. She swallowed the bitter taste rising in her throat. Not again. Not at this stage of her life. Not after everything she had built. "I've done nothing wrong," Ava said quietly, "and you can solve this right here." Her seat is clearly printed. Whitney withdrew her boarding pass sharply, as though caught. "It must be an error," she insisted. "I always sit in 1 Alpha." Mason didn't address her. He focused only on Ava. "Ma'am, if you don't comply, I'll have to call airport security to assist." A silence fell heavy and sharp. Ava's heart beat once, painfully. And she knew. The crack in the glass had now become a fracture. For a long moment, Ava didn't move. The world around her did, though subtly, like a ripple across water. A woman in row 2 stopped scrolling on her phone. A man in row 3 lifted his head from behind a business magazine. Even the soft hum of the cabin seemed to tense, as if the aircraft itself were holding its breath. Ava felt all of it. Every gaze, every shift in posture, every unspoken question that echoed in the silent space between human judgment and human fear. She had been here before, not on a plane, not in a seat she'd helped create, but in these moments, these little fractures in dignity that, over time, carved deep grooves in the spirit. She could practically hear her mother's voice again, calm, steady, a reminder. Baby, never let them define you before you define yourself. Ava raised her chin a fraction of an inch. Her heartbeat steadied. I'm not stepping off this aircraft, she said quietly. Her voice wasn't loud, but it had weight like a stone dropped into a still pond, ripples spreading outward. Ethan Clark flinched. He looked between the gate supervisor and Ava, as if waiting for someone to tell him what to feel. Whitney Caldwell let out a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, and not quite a scoff, more like disbelief dripping with irritation. This is insane, Whitney muttered. She's holding up the entire flight. A ripple of tension rolled through the cabin. A man 2 seats back exhaled sharply through his nose. A woman leaned toward her husband, whispering something that barely rose above the hum of the vents. Ava kept her eyes on Mason Lee. Why are you asking me to get off the plane? Ava asked. You have both boarding passes. One is correct, one is not. The solution is clear. Mason shifted his weight, jaw clamping tight. He didn't want to be here. That much was obvious. He didn't want confrontation. He didn't want paperwork. He didn't want complaints from a high-status passenger who seemed to know every line of her loyalty perks by heart. He wanted easy, and Ava was not easy. Ma'am, he repeated, voice firmer this time. You need to step off so we can resolve the issue at the podium. Ava inhaled slowly. She had learned a long time ago that people didn't always listen to words, they listened to tone. So she softened her voice, not in submission but in strength. There is no issue to resolve. You have the facts. You simply don't like them. Whitney let out an explosive gasp. Are you calling me a liar? I'm saying, Ava replied, still calm, that the seat assignment is clear. That's not an opinion. That's the reality on your boarding pass. The truth, spoken plainly, had a way of landing harder than any insult. Whitney recoiled not physically at first, but in her expression. Her eyes darted around the cabin, checking to see who might have heard, who might have witnessed the crack in her perfect composure. A few heads turned away. Others didn't bother hiding their interest. Whitney's voice dropped to a hiss. I don't appreciate your tone. Ava's eyes finally met hers directly. A gaze steady, unwavering, like the gaze of someone who'd spent years learning not to shrink beneath the weight of prejudice. I'm not responsible for your comfort, Ava said, only for my dignity. That sentence, soft as it was, landed like thunder. Even Ethan froze. Mason's patience snapped. Or maybe his fear did. Security is on the way, he announced quietly. The words didn't ring out. They didn't echo. They slipped from his mouth like something inevitable, something final. Ava closed her eyes. Just 1 second, 1 breath, 1 attempt to gather herself before the world caved in. She knew what would happen next. She knew because it had happened before, to strangers she read about, to friends who whispered their humiliation over coffee, to co-workers who carried silent scars. Her mind drifted briefly, painfully, to her younger self, standing in a department store at 16, followed by a guard because she looked suspicious, to her first job interview, where the receptionist mistook her for the cleaning staff, to the VC meeting where someone asked if she was there to take notes. A lifetime of fractures, a lifetime of choosing gentleness over anger, a lifetime of hoping things might change. But somehow, standing here in a seat she helped build, literally designed down to the stitching, the fracture felt sharper than all the others combined. Ava opened her eyes again. The cabin blurred at the edges. Not from tears, she refused to cry here, but from the intensity of holding everything inside. "Ma'am," Mason said once more, "if you don't step off now, you will be removed." Removed. The word stung. Ava turned slightly, letting her gaze fall on the aisle, then the galley, then the exit door. She wasn't a threat. She wasn't disruptive. She wasn't raising her voice. She wasn't even standing. But somehow, she had become the problem. Inside her chest, something old and tired gave a long, aching sigh. And yet, something else, something firm and steady rose to meet it. She lifted her face toward Mason. "You are making a mistake," Ava said. Mason didn't answer. Instead, he stepped back as two security officers appeared in the doorway. They wore Navy uniforms, radios strapped to their shoulders, calm expressions carved with practiced detachment. They weren't here to judge. They weren't here to understand. They were here to remove an obstacle. "Ma'am," one officer said gently, "we need you to come with us." Whitney exhaled, relieved. The sound was almost triumphant. Ava's stomach tightened, her pulse quickened. But she didn't move. "I have done nothing wrong," she said. The officer's face softened, not with empathy, but with pity. "It's just procedure." Procedure. The same word always used to justify injustice. Ava's fingers curled around the armrest. She didn't hold on out of stubbornness. She held on because letting go felt like giving in to all the years of being viewed as less. The officer stepped closer. "Ma'am," he repeated, quieter this time, "please." Ava could hear her heartbeat in her ears. Not racing now, steady. A drum of determination. She wasn't angry. She wasn't yelling. She was simply anchoring herself to the truth of her presence. "This is my seat," Ava whispered. But truth often doesn't matter when perception has already taken its place. The officer exchanged a look with his partner, a silent agreement. Then hands touched her arms, not harsh, but firm. A collective gasp swept through the cabin, a sound like a dozen souls inhaling at once. Ava felt herself rise, not by choice, but by force. Her left sneaker scraped the edge of the footwell. Her book slipped from her lap and tumbled to the floor with a soft, heartbreaking sound. The world tilted. Voices blurred. Emotion pressed against her ribs like a heavy weight. Somewhere behind her, a passenger murmured, "This isn't right." But nobody moved. Nobody intervened. Whitney watched with an expression of stiff satisfaction. Ethan looked sick. Mason kept his eyes fixed on the door, not Ava. Ava didn't struggle. She didn't shout. She let her body go, still sharp stillness, the kind that comes from realizing there is no winning, only surviving. As the officers guided her down the aisle, she looked straight ahead. Not down, not at anyone's face. Just straight forward, toward the open doorway, where the harsh fluorescent lights of the jet bridge spilled into the warm first-class cabin like a cold flood. Her shoe slipped halfway off as she crossed the threshold. Her dignity felt heavier than her step, but inside her mind, one sentence rose clear and quiet. Not like this. Not without the truth. The jet bridge was colder than Ava expected. A sharp, artificial chill seeped from the metal walls, brushing her face like the first breath of winter. Behind her, the soft warmth of the first-class cabin disappeared as the door closed with a dull thud, a sound that felt strangely personal, like being shut out of a home she helped build. The officers flanked her on each side, not rough, but undeniably controlling. Their footsteps echoed in the long tunnel, a slow rhythm that somehow made her humiliation louder. One officer cleared his throat. "Ma'am, we'd prefer if you cooperated. This doesn't have to escalate." Ava didn't look at him. Her voice stayed calm, though her throat felt tight. "I am cooperating. I walked when you asked." He hesitated before saying, "The supervisor labeled it a non-compliance issue." Ava let out a soft breath through her nose. "He labeled it that," she said, "because it was easier than telling the truth." The officers exchanged a brief glance, a subtle confusion. It wasn't that they didn't believe her, it was that they didn't understand the layers beneath her words. At the end of the jet bridge, a small cluster of passengers waited for another flight boarding at a nearby gate. Conversations paused as they watched Ava approach. A black woman escorted by officers. One shoe half loose. Hoodie slightly pulled to the side. Backpack strap twisted from the abruptness of her removal. To them, she was a silhouette of a story they would never hear fully. And assumptions filled the rest. She caught fragments of whispers. What did she do? Was she yelling? Maybe she refused instructions. A teenager pointed at her sneaker, dangling halfway off, and snickered. Ava kept walking. Inside the terminal, the harsh fluorescent lights flickered faintly, buzzing. The officers guided her to the side, near Gate 29, where a cluster of empty chairs sat near a large window overlooking the runway. "Please have a seat," the taller officer said. Ava remained standing. "I'd prefer to stay where I am." He didn't press it. But he stood in front of her as if she were a fragile item that needed to be guarded. Passengers continued to walk by, some glancing, some staring openly. Their eyes slid across her like she was an inconvenience on display. Each look left a small bruise on her pride. She straightened her hoodie and pulled her sneaker back into place with a quiet motion. The officer watched, awkwardly shifting his weight. "You okay, ma'am?" he asked. Ava answered honestly. "No. But I will be." Something softened in his expression, just a little. Not understanding, more like discomfort at witnessing a quiet dignity he didn't expect. Before he could respond, the gate supervisor appeared at the entrance of the jet bridge. Mason Lee. His badge still clipped neatly, his hair slightly disheveled from the tension. He held a clipboard but didn't look at it. He looked at Ava first, then quickly away, as if her gaze carried too much truth for him to handle. Ava straightened her posture. "Mason," she said, voice steady. He swallowed. "Ma'am, we're working to resolve the confusion." "There is no confusion," Ava replied. "Only choices." He didn't answer. The silence held between them heavy, stretched, sharp. Ava could read the guilt in his posture, the stiffness in his shoulders. But guilt didn't fix damage. It merely pointed at the place where damage was done. A small group of people gathered near the windows, curious onlookers. Some held phones half raised, none fully recording yet, but watchers hungry for a spectacle. Ava felt a heat behind her eyes, anger, ache, exhaustion, all blending into something deeper. A heaviness in the ribs, a tightening in her jaw. But she refused to let tears fall here, not in front of them. Not in this cold terminal where dignity was so easily mistaken for defiance. She took a breath so slow and deliberate it almost steadied her. "Mason," she said, "look at me." He hesitated. Then he did. "What exactly did I do wrong?" Ava asked. He opened his mouth, closed it, then whispered, I thought you were." His voice broke off. He didn't say the word. He didn't need to. Not someone who belonged there? Ava nodded slowly, the motion calm but devastating. "That's what I thought." A brief, fragile stillness followed. Then Whitney Caldwell's voice pierced it like a needle. She appeared at the jet bridge entrance, guided by Ethan Clark, who seemed torn between wanting to shrink away and needing to follow what he saw as procedure. Whitney scanned the scene, Ava, the officers, Mason, and let out a breathy, self-satisfied sigh. "I'm glad that's settled," she said. "Now, can I please be seated? I have meetings tomorrow." Ava looked at Whitney for the first time since being dragged out. Really looked at her. Not at the perfect hair, or the diamond studs, or the tailored blazer, but at the fragile fear beneath the arrogance, the insecurity wrapped in privilege, the need to feel superior to someone. Whitney shifted under the weight of Ava's quiet gaze. Ava didn't speak to her. She simply observed her, expression unreadable. And somehow that silence seemed to unsettle Whitney more than any words. Ethan looked at Ava with something like regret flickering behind his eyes. It wasn't strong enough to become accountability, but it was enough to crack something small inside him. Mason rubbed the back of his neck. "We're still working on clarifying the seating arrangement," he said to Whitney. "It's clear," Whitney snapped. "She was in my seat." She admitted. Ava cut her off without raising her voice. "I admitted nothing." Her tone was still soft, still calm, but even the officer nearest her paused at the shift. Whitney blinked, taken aback. Well, I'm sure the system messed up," she stammered. "That happens." Ava's gaze didn't waver. "What happened," she said, "was bias, not a glitch." Whitney inhaled sharply, color rising in her cheeks. "I don't appreciate the implication." "It's not an implication," Ava replied. "It's a fact." Passengers nearby slowed their steps. A few watched intently. One woman frowned in disapproval, not at Ava, but at Whitney. Mason cleared his throat, voice cracking under pressure. Let's de-escalate." Ava turned to him. "Then stop escalating," she said. A single sentence. Measured, controlled, and piercing. Mason looked at the officers, silently pleading for help he didn't quite know how to ask for. Before anything else could unfold, Ethan's radio crackled softly. "Gate 29, hold position. Do not close aircraft door. Repeat, do not close aircraft door. Senior management inbound." Ethan froze. Mason stiffened. Whitney frowned, confused. Ava simply closed her eyes for one brief second. There it was. The shift. The moment she'd been waiting for, not out of spite, but out of truth. The officer nearest her adjusted his stance. "Ma'am," he said gently, "seems like someone from corporate is coming." Ava nodded. Her voice remained even. "They should." The terminal grew quieter, as if the entire space sensed something tipping. A new energy rippled through the air, uncertainty mixed with tension, like the moment before a storm breaks open. A teenage girl near the window whispered to her mother, "Did something happen? Why is corporate coming?" Her mother replied, "That woman didn't seem disruptive at all." Another passenger murmured, "This is going to blow up online." Ava didn't react. She stood still, grounded in her own space. For the first time since being pulled from her seat, she felt her breath loosen in her chest. Not relief, just clarity. The truth had begun its slow walk toward the surface. And truth had a way of arriving whether people welcomed it or not. Then, down the long, polished corridor, a figure came into view. Tall, determined, wearing a charcoal suit and an expression carved in controlled fury. Ava recognized him instantly. Stephen Ross, CEO of Liberty Air, her colleague, her partner, her friend through a decade of building a dream that now felt more fragile than ever. Whitney saw him too. She straightened, smoothing her blazer, preparing a charming smile. She had no idea what was coming. Ava felt the faintest tremor in her hands. Not fear, not anger, just the weight of everything about to unfold. Her heart steadied, her spine straightened, because she knew the fracture was about to become an earthquake. Stephen Ross approached with the heavy, determined stride of someone who had already heard enough to be furious but was forcing himself to stay measured. The polished shoes, the fitted charcoal suit, the neatly combed salt and pepper hair. Stephen always carried the weight of leadership in his posture. But today, that weight looked different. It looked personal. Ava saw it instantly. And for a brief moment, just half a breath, her heart tightened. Not in fear, not in shame, but in something more complex. Something like grief mixed with relief. Stephen Ross was not simply her CEO. He had been her partner in building Liberty Air from the ground up. He had stood beside her in rooms where people doubted her, dismissed her, or pretended she was not the strongest strategist in the room. If Stephen was here, then the story had already reached places she never intended it to reach. Behind Stephen came Taylor Briggs, general counsel. Younger than Stephen, but with the sharp eyes of someone trained to spot liability before it breathed. Her sleek ponytail didn't move as she walked. Her expression was ice. Focused, controlled. Behind them, two members of corporate security hurried to keep up. Whitney Caldwell's confident smile crumbled at the sight of them. This looks serious, she murmured to Ethan. Ethan didn't respond. His face had gone pale. Mason Lee swallowed so hard Ava could hear it. Stephen reached them first. He didn't greet anyone. He didn't shake hands. He didn't smile. He went straight to Ava. "Ava," he breathed, voice low with disbelief. "Are you okay?" A hush washed over the area, soft but absolute. Even people passing by slowed to listen. Ava didn't nod, didn't smile. She simply said, "I'm standing." Stephen's face tightened. "They put their hands on you." It wasn't a question. It was a realization. A terrible one. Ava answered with a steady voice. "They removed me from my seat." Stephen closed his eyes briefly, jaw flexing. When he opened them, the fury in his gaze burned so cold it chilled the air. He turned not to Whitney, not to the officers, but directly to Mason. "Explain," Stephen said. One word. Soft. Sharp. The kind of word that held a career inside it. Mason's mouth opened, but sound didn't come. Eventually, he forced a shaky breath. "Sir, there was a seated passenger issue, a dispute over." Taylor Briggs stepped forward, her voice slicing clean through his excuses. "Did you check the manifest?" Mason blinked. I looked." "Did you check her boarding pass?" she asked, pointing at Ava. Yes, but did you check Miss Caldwell's?" Whitney stiffened. "I'm sorry, what does my pass have to do with?" Taylor raised a hand, silencing her effortlessly. "It has everything to do with it." Whitney's jaw clicked shut. Stephen crossed his arms. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. His disappointment was louder than any raised voice. "So," Stephen said calmly, "walk me through it." A Liberty Air co-founder was seated in her assigned seat. A passenger with a different seat assignment told your crew she belonged in first class instead. And you believed her. Whitney stepped forward, fluttering her hands in protest. "Wait, you're saying she's..." But Stephen didn't even look at her. Not yet. He waited for Mason to answer. Mason's voice shrank. "Sir, she seemed upset and busy, and she said she always sits." "So you didn't verify," Stephen said. Not harsh, not loud, just final. Mason stared down at his shoes. Stephen exhaled through his nose a slow, controlled breath. He looked at the officers next. "You forcibly removed this woman from a flight," he said. "Tell me on what grounds." The taller officer cleared his throat. "We were told she was non-compliant." Stephen's eyes narrowed. "Was she yelling?" "No, sir." "Threatening anyone?" "No." "Causing any disruption?" "No." Stephen let that silence sit, let everyone hear the truth. Finally, he asked the question that cracked the air open. "Then why was she labeled a threat?" The officer didn't answer. He didn't have an answer. Taylor Briggs lifted her tablet, swiping through something quickly. Then she held it up. "I just reviewed the live passenger report submitted by the crew," she said. "It states Miss Morgan was uncooperative, suspicious, and refusing instructions." Ava felt her stomach drop not from surprise, but from the pain of seeing something so familiar dressed up in official language. Stephen said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence made the accusation roar with injustice. Whitney finally stepped in, flustered and indignant. "Look, this is all a misunderstanding," she said. "I didn't know who she was. I just assumed..." She stopped, realizing too late what she was about to confess aloud. Ava spoke into the silence, her voice low. "You assumed I didn't belong." Whitney's face reddened. "That's not what I meant." "That's exactly what you meant," Ava replied softly. "And you weren't the only one." Mason's breath hitched. Ethan closed his eyes. The taller officer shifted uncomfortably. Passengers around them froze, realizing they were witnessing something far bigger than a seating dispute. Stephen finally turned to Whitney. "Miss Caldwell," he said, "show me your boarding pass." Whitney hesitated. Well, this is unnecessary." "Now," Stephen said. Her fingers trembled as she handed it over. Stephen read it once. Then again. He let out a humorless laugh, one that sent a wave of dread through everyone standing there. "Seat 3D, he said. "Not even the same row, not even the same cabin tier." Whitney opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Ethan took a step back, ashamed. Mason's eyes flicked to the floor again. Stephen returned the pass without looking at her. "You lied," he said simply. She shook her head frantically. "No, I didn't lie. I've always had first class. You felt entitled to a seat you didn't pay for," Ava said quietly, "and when you didn't get it, you weaponized your discomfort." Whitney covered her mouth with her trembling fingers. Mason stepped forward. "Sir, I'm deeply sorry. I didn't realize." "That's the point," Stephen cut in. "You didn't realize. You didn't check. You didn't verify. You made a decision based entirely on assumption." His gaze hardened. "And that assumption caused harm." Ava felt her throat tighten. Not from pain, but because hearing Stephen say the truth aloud plainly, firmly felt like air entering a room that had been sealed too tightly. Taylor looked at Ava. "Ava, do you want to step aside? We can take you to the executive lounge." Ava shook her head. "No. I want to finish this where it started, right here." Stephen nodded once, respectfully. Then he turned back to the group. "Let me be absolutely clear," he said, voice steady but sharp. "Ava Morgan is not simply a valued customer. She is the co-founder of this airline. She built the first class you're so protective of. She designed the very seat she was dragged from." Gasps spread through the surrounding passengers. Whitney stumbled backward a step, her face draining of color. The officers exchanged horrified glances. Ethan looked like his soul was leaving his body. Mason looked physically ill. Stephen continued. "You didn't just mishandle a boarding dispute. You humiliated one of the most important leaders in this corporation. And worse, you humiliated her for the crime of not fitting your idea of who belongs in first class." Silence swallowed the terminal. For a moment, even the airport announcement seemed to pause. Ava watched the faces around her. Shock, regret, shame, curiosity, all mixing into something complicated and heavy. Stephen exhaled slowly, then turned back to Ava. "I'm so sorry," he said. A simple sentence, but full of weight. Ava held his gaze. And for the first time since she was dragged from her seat, she felt something shift inside her chest, small, fragile, but real. A place inside her that had been tight and aching loosened by a fraction. She nodded. "Thank you." For a long moment, the terminal felt suspended in time. Ava stood at the center of it, calm, steady, composed. But the air around her vibrated with the collective realization spreading through the crowd. People whispered her name quietly now. Some recognized her. Some only recognized the injustice. But everyone felt the shift. Stephen Ross took a careful step closer to Ava, lowering his voice so it stayed between them. "Ava, I need to ask again. Are you all right?" Ava held her breath for half a second. Not because she was unsure, but because she wasn't used to anyone asking her that question with genuine concern in their voice. "I'm managing," she said. The truth, but softened. Stephen's expression darkened. Not at her, at what had happened to her. Taylor Briggs stood slightly behind him, arms crossed, observing everything with sharpened focus. She was assessing liability, risk, legal angles, but her eyes told a deeper story. Anger, controlled, but unmistakable. Around them, the surrounding passengers pretended not to listen, but they did, every word, every breath. Whitney Caldwell hovered a few feet away, her earlier confidence evaporating into raw fear. Her hands trembled as she tried to smooth her blazer. Every time Ava glanced in her direction, Whitney looked away sharply, unable to hold her gaze. Mason's hands hung at his sides, useless and heavy. Ethan stood stiffly, his face ashen, hands twisting nervously behind his back. And the two officers, now realizing they had unknowingly manhandled the co-founder of the airline, stood frozen in rigid discomfort. Stephen looked at all of them, one by one. Then he spoke, not loudly, but firmly enough that the entire section of the terminal heard every syllable. "We're not going to pretend this is a simple mistake," he said. "The entire system failed Miss Morgan today." No one moved. No one breathed. Stephen continued, "We value safety. We value procedure. But none of those things were upheld today. Instead, bias made the decisions. Assumptions made the decisions. And those assumptions caused harm." Ava watched him carefully. She appreciated his words. But words alone weren't justice. Not yet. Stephen took a breath and faced Whitney. "Miss Caldwell." Whitney flinched. Yes, sir." "You initiated this incident?" Whitney swallowed hard. I asked a question. I believed." She couldn't say the rest. Couldn't bring herself to complete the sentence. "I believed she didn't belong there." Stephen didn't raise his voice. Didn't shame her. But his tone offered no room for hiding. "You could have simply shown your boarding pass." Whitney's throat bobbed. "I didn't think I needed to." "That is precisely the problem." Her eyes filled with panic. "I swear I wasn't trying to." Stephen held up a hand. She stopped instantly. "This will be addressed later," he said. "For now, step aside." Whitney moved quickly, almost stumbling. Stephen turned to Mason. The weight of his gaze made Mason's knees look unsteady. "You escalated instead of verifying facts." Mason's voice cracked. "Sir, I was trying to—" "No," Stephen cut him off. "You were trying to appease the passenger who complained the loudest, not the passenger who had the truth." Mason's face collapsed inward. A man realizing he might lose everything in a moment. Stephen turned next to Ethan. "You're young. I expect mistakes, but not ones that endanger our values." Ethan's eyes glistened. "I'm so sorry, sir. I didn't mean to." "You didn't think." "That's the issue." Stephen exhaled and turned back to Ava. "I want you back on that flight," he said gently. "In your rightful seat." Ava felt something shift in her chest. A small sigh of relief, but tangled tightly with the weight of everything she'd endured. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she considered the space between what she deserved and what she could accept. Returning to that cabin meant returning to the very place she was dragged from. Returning to the stairs. Returning to the seat that now held the imprint of humiliation. Could she step back into that space with her dignity intact? She wasn't sure. A moment passed. Then another. Finally, Ava said, "I need my backpack." It wasn't a request. It was a declaration that she would not step foot on that plane as a wounded woman. She would go as herself, whole, grounded, steady. Stephen nodded to Taylor. "Get it." But Taylor shook her head. "No. They dragged her out. They will return it." The "they" was unmistakable. Mason looked physically pained. Ethan went pale. Stephen's jaw tightened. "Now." Mason stumbled toward the jet bridge, nearly tripping in his haste. Inside the terminal, a young woman seated nearby whispered, "Good." A man next to her nodded slowly. About time someone held them accountable. Ava heard these comments, but she didn't let them feed her pride. Truthfully, she felt no pride at all, just a deep ache in her ribs that came from holding herself together while the world pulled her apart. Her legs suddenly felt weak. Not shaky, just heavy. As if every injustice she'd witnessed in the past was settling on her shoulders again. She reached for a nearby seat, lowering herself without drawing attention. Stephen crouched down slightly, voice soft. You don't have to go back on that plane. Ava looked at him. Her exhaustion showed in the faint tremble of her eyelids. And let them write the story as if I was at fault? She whispered. No, I'm not giving them that. Stephen nodded, his expression a mixture of admiration and pain. Taylor knelt next to them. Ava, we will handle everything from here. You don't have to speak. You don't have to defend yourself. Just breathe. Ava smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. Thank you, Taylor. But breathing is the only thing I've been doing since they pulled me out. A soft tremor escaped her chest, not a sob, not a sigh. Just a release. A tiny fracture in her composure. Stephen noticed. His own eyes softened. We're fixing this, he said. Every part of it. Before Ava could respond, Mason returned breathless, flushed, holding her leather backpack like a sacred object. He extended it with both hands, too afraid to meet her eyes. Ava accepted it silently. She ran her hand along the worn strap, grounding herself through touch, feeling the memories etched into the fabric. She stood up slowly, adjusting the weight on her shoulder. Stephen rose beside her. Ready? He asked. Ava didn't say yes. She simply straightened her spine. The officers stepped aside immediately. Whitney shrank back. Mason avoided eye contact entirely. Ethan looked like he might cry from guilt. And the passengers? Phones quietly lifted. Cameras discreetly pointed. Everyone would want to know what happened next. Ava took one step toward the jet bridge. Her heart beat slower now, controlled. A kind of stillness settling over her. Because this next walk back onto the plane would not be a walk of humiliation. It would be a walk of truth. The walk back toward the jet bridge felt longer than when Ava had been escorted off. Earlier, she had been pulled in this direction with hands gripping her arms, her shoes dragging across the carpet. Shame, walking ahead of her like a shadow she couldn't outrun. Now every step was reclaimed. Steady, measured, hers. Stephen Ross walked to her left, Taylor Briggs to her right. Neither spoke. Neither rushed. They simply matched her pace, creating a quiet formation that told the entire gate area one unmistakable truth. She was not returning alone. She was returning with authority. Behind her, the soft murmur of witnesses mixed with the electric hum of overhead lights. She didn't have to look back to know people were watching. Phones were recording. Eyes were following every inch of her movement. For once, she didn't shrink from it. As she approached the mouth of the jet bridge, Ava paused. The bright rectangle of the aircraft door glowed at the end of the tunnel. That glow felt heavier than before, like stepping toward a past wound she hadn't fully processed yet. Stephen noticed her hesitation and lowered his voice. We can pause if you need to. Ava shook her head gently. No. If I stop now, I might not start again. Stephen nodded. Then we go. They stepped onto the jet bridge. The air inside was colder than the terminal. The metal walls buzzed softly. The distant click of carts inside the plane echoed faintly, followed by the muted sound of a flight attendant's hushed conversation. Halfway down, Ava slowed again just slightly because her mind betrayed her with a memory. Her palms pressed against armrests. Her breath caught in her throat. The sudden tug on her arms, the scrape of her sneaker on the floor. Her book falling, pages scattering like clipped wings. A pinch of pain tightened beneath her ribs. Taylor walked a fraction closer, her voice soft enough not to disturb the air. If you need to stop, Ava, we will stop. Ava's fingers curled lightly around her backpack straps. It's all right, she whispered. I'm just remembering. Stephen's voice came quietly. Remembering is okay, but we're not going to relive it. Not today. Ava inhaled, steadied, and resumed walking. At the end of the jet bridge, Captain Hughes stood at the aircraft door, tall, uniform, crisp, hat tucked under his arm. His expression carried weight, humility, and the kind of sincere regret Ava rarely saw in people at his level of authority. He stepped aside with reverence. Miss Morgan, he said softly, welcome back. On behalf of the flight deck, I am truly sorry. Ava offered a small nod. Thank you, Captain. He held her gaze for 1 second longer, as if silently promising that the wrong done to her inside this cabin would never happen on his aircraft again. Then he turned to the flight attendant nearest the door, a senior crew member Ava had not seen earlier, likely brought on board during the incident. Clear the aisle, Captain Hughes instructed quietly. The attendant moved toward the front of the cabin, her voice calm but firm. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We have a returning passenger coming through the aisle. Inside the first-class cabin, silence spread like mist. Not forced, not mechanical, heavy, aware. Ava stepped across the threshold, Stephen and Taylor following just behind. The warmth of the cabin lights washed over her face again, but this time it felt different. Earlier, the lights had seemed soft, inviting. Now they felt sharp, revealing every expression, every eye, every tightened breath. A dozen heads turned, some curious, some sympathetic, some ashamed. Not one person looked away. Row 1 was closest. The man across the aisle who had stared at Ava earlier with mild suspicion now looked at her with something closer to regret. He straightened in his seat as if offering a silent apology. Row 2, however, held the real storm. Whitney Caldwell sat in seat 3D, now the seat she had been assigned all along. But she sat there small, fragile, barely holding herself upright. The earlier arrogance was gone, replaced by a bone-deep realization of what her actions had set in motion. Her eyes locked onto Ava, wide and brimming with fear. Not fear of Ava. Fear of the truth laid bare. Ava didn't look at her for more than a second. Enough to acknowledge what had happened. Not enough to grant Whitney any more space in her mind. Ava continued toward row 1. Passengers parted their gaze like a curtain being drawn back. Stephen walked half a step behind her, his expression controlled. Taylor held her tablet close, observing, protecting. When Ava reached her seat, seat 1A, the cabin seemed to exhale with her. She stopped, looked at the seat where her book had fallen, the seat where her dignity had been dismissed, the seat she helped design with her own hands. The blanket had been straightened, the seat belt neatly crossed, the overhead light dimmed. Someone had tried to make it appear untouched. But Ava felt the truth of the moment anyway. Stephen leaned closer. You don't have to sit if you're not ready. Ava hesitated. Her fingers lightly brushed the headrest. The leather was cool beneath her touch. Soft, smooth, familiar. A memory of her early days at Liberty Air surfaced. Blueprints on the table. Mock seats in an empty warehouse. Her arguing passionately with engineers about armrest angles. She had built this space. She had earned this space. And no one, no misunderstanding, no assumption, no prejudice would take it from her. She inhaled, sat down slowly, and let the seat hold her weight. A soft murmur rippled through first class. Not gossip, not judgment. Something closer to collective relief. Stephen placed a gentle hand on the top of her seat. You tell me the moment you want to deplane, he said. With or without the flight. Ava nodded. I'll stay. Taylor stepped forward. We'll be right here until pushback. And reachable throughout the flight. Ethan Clark appeared at the curtain, pale and shaken. He approached with slow, uncertain steps. Miss Morgan, he whispered. I don't even have the words. I'm so sorry. I mishandled everything. Ava raised a hand gently, stopping him without harshness. You made a choice you didn't think about, she said quietly. What matters is what you learn from it. Ethan's face seemed to fold inward. He nodded, blinking back tears. I'll do better, he said. Ava gave a small, weary nod. Captain Hughes approached. Cabin secure, he said. Ready on your command. Stephen stepped back, allowing the captain to resume control. As he and Taylor prepared to leave the cabin, Stephen looked at Ava one more time. You're not alone, he said gently. Not in this seat, not in this fight. Then he and Taylor stepped out of the aircraft, leaving Ava in the warm glow of the cabin lights. The door closed softly behind them. Ava leaned back against the headrest. Her breath trembled, not from fear now, but from the weight of everything she'd carried. Rows of passengers watched her in silence, not with pity, with respect. And for the first time since the ordeal began, Ava felt something return to her chest. A spark of power. Small, steady, real. Her dignity had not been restored by management, not by the passengers, not by justice. She restored it herself, in the simple act of sitting back down in the seat meant for her. And outside the aircraft window, the lights of the runway shimmered softly, as if nodding in quiet approval. The soft click of the aircraft door closing carried a weight far heavier than metal meeting metal. It felt like a final punctuation mark at the end of a long, painful sentence, a sentence Ava hadn't written but had been forced to read out loud. Inside the first-class cabin, the air settled into a quiet that felt almost sacred. Every passenger remained still, aware they had just witnessed something irreversible, something uncomfortable, something true. Ava sat upright, back pressed lightly against the seat she had reclaimed. She wasn't relaxed. She wasn't angry. She was simply present, a rare feeling for someone who had spent her entire life navigating rooms where her presence was constantly questioned. The purser, a middle-aged man named Martin Hayes, who had quietly replaced Tiffany during the chaos, approached Ava with deliberate, measured steps. "Miss Morgan," he said softly, "may I get you something? Water, tea, maybe ginger ale?" His voice carried sincerity, not performance. Ava appreciated that. "Water, please," she said. Martin nodded. "Of course." As he walked away, the passenger in seat 1C, an older man with silver hair and kind eyes, leaned slightly closer, careful not to intrude. "Ma'am," he whispered, "I'm deeply sorry for what happened. I saw everything." Ava gave him a small, grateful nod. "Thank you." He hesitated, then added, "If there's anything I can do, anything, you let me know." She nodded again. "Your kindness is enough." The man exhaled slowly, like her words had eased his guilt. Ava turned her gaze toward the window. Outside, ground crew walked beneath the wings, their neon vests reflecting the yellow-white floodlights. The engines whirred softly, not yet roaring with the force of takeoff. Inside her chest, though, something moved. Not loud, not violent, just a shift, a tension releasing, a new tension forming. She wasn't sure which was heavier. Martin returned with a cold bottle of water. He handed it to her with both hands, a gesture usually reserved for royalty or elders. Ava twisted the cap and took a slow sip, letting the cool liquid soothe her parched throat. Behind her, the murmur of passengers grew quietly. She handled it with so much grace. "Did you hear what the CEO said? That woman, what was her name? Caldwell? She should be ashamed. I've never seen something like that happen in real life. I hope she sues every single one of them." Ava didn't turn. She didn't absorb the praise or the outrage. She simply listened, letting the voices settle around her like distant waves. She didn't want to be a spectacle. She didn't want to be anyone's headline. She just wanted to be a passenger on a flight from San Francisco to New York. But life had a cruel way of turning ordinary moments into defining ones. The flight attendants moved through the cabin with a strange, careful choreography. They weren't simply serving passengers. They were walking on the shards of what had happened, cautious not to step wrong again. Ava felt it deeply. The pressure they now carried, the fear of doing or saying the wrong thing, the worry that every gesture might be misinterpreted. She knew that feeling, intimately. She had lived it for years. Captain Hughes's voice broke through the cabin speakers, warm and steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We are now prepared for departure. Please fasten your seatbelts. We'll be pushing back momentarily." Ava closed her eyes briefly, letting the words settle. Pushback. She felt like she had been pushing back all her life against assumptions, expectations, quiet dismissals that chipped away at dignity in invisible ways. As the aircraft began to move away from the gate, the cabin lights dimmed slightly. A gentle hum filled the cabin, harmonizing with the soft vibration beneath Ava's feet. The man in 1C spoke softly again, almost to himself. "This plane feels different now." Ava opened her eyes. "What do you mean?" He gave a small, sad smile. "It feels like we all woke up." Ava didn't respond. She just looked ahead, her gaze landing on the curtain separating first class from the rest of the aircraft. Behind it, she could hear the restless shifting of passengers, those who had heard bits of the commotion, those who had caught glimpses of Ava being escorted off, those who were now wondering what truth lived behind the curtain. Martin collected glasses, his hands steady but his breathing slightly faster than normal. Ava recognized the signs, someone trying very hard to perform calm. Before takeoff, he approached Ava again, lowering his voice. "Miss Morgan, I want you to know, none of us here condone what happened." Ava studied him for a moment. "Intentions aren't the problem," she said gently. "It's the silence that follows them." Martin's eyes softened. "I won't be silent." Something in Ava's chest loosened. "Thank you," she said. And she meant it. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Ava felt a tightness in her stomach, a blend of adrenaline, fatigue, and the emotional weight of the past hour. She let her mind drift, even for a moment, because she needed a place to rest inside herself. Her mother's voice returned, soft and steady. "You deserve the spaces you earn, baby. Never apologize for being where you're supposed to be." Ava inhaled deeply. She could almost smell her mother's kitchen. Warm cornbread, lemon tea. A slow Sunday afternoon with sunlight slipping through half-closed curtains. Her mother would tell her she did right. Her mother would tell her she carried grace that didn't break. Ava blinked slowly as the engines roared to life. The plane accelerated. Lights blurred past the windows. The cabin trembled with rising speed. Then the wheels lifted off the ground, and Ava felt the familiar, fleeting moment of weightlessness. But the real weight she carried didn't lift with the plane. It stayed in her chest, heavy and unresolved. Several minutes into the climb, after the ding of the seatbelt sign turning off, a flight attendant from economy approached the curtain. She whispered something to Martin. Martin nodded, then crouched beside Ava again. "There's something you should know," he said quietly. Ava turned slightly toward him. "What is it?" Martin glanced around to make sure no one was listening. "Some passengers back there. They recorded everything." Ava stilled. Her breath caught. Martin continued carefully. "The moment they removed you." Miss Caldwell's comments. What was said? A faint chill ran down Ava's spine. "Passengers are already posting," he added. "It's spreading." Ava didn't respond at first. Her fingers tightened around the bottle of water. Of course it was spreading. This was the world now where truth didn't wait for official statements, where pain became content, where injustice traveled faster than any airplane. Ava's voice was quiet when she finally spoke. "I didn't want this to become public." Martin's expression softened. "You didn't choose it. But sometimes the world needs to see what you lived." Ava sat back, her heart heavy. She didn't want to be a symbol. She didn't want to be proof of bias. She didn't want her worst moment broadcast to millions. But she also knew deep down there were people out there who had lived the same moment in silence. People who needed to see that someone else had endured it too. Someone who didn't fold. Someone who reclaimed her seat. Ava looked at her hands. They were steady now, still tired, but steady. She whispered to herself, "I didn't want to be anyone's lesson." The man in seat 1C must have heard, because he replied softly, "Maybe you're not a lesson. Maybe you're a mirror." Ava turned her head slowly. His expression was gentle, understanding. That's what stories do, he said. They show us things we'd rather ignore. A quiet, aching silence followed. Then, from the back of the cabin, a familiar voice rose. Timid, but loud enough to break the hush. "Miss Morgan?" Ava turned. A young black woman from premium economy stood at the curtain, clutching her tote bag against her chest. Her eyes were shining, not with pity, but with something that looked almost like gratitude. Can I just say," she whispered, "you handled everything today with more grace than most of us would have had." The woman's voice trembled. "And, seeing you stand your ground," it meant something. Ava's heart squeezed painfully. She swallowed around the lump in her throat. "Thank you," she said softly. The woman nodded, wiped her eyes discreetly, and returned to her seat. Ava exhaled slowly, turning her face toward the window again. Outside, the clouds glowed gold and purple as the sun dipped toward the horizon. Inside, for the first time since the ordeal began, Ava felt something small and fragile bloom inside her chest. Hope. Bruised, but alive. Not because she had won. Not because justice had been served, but because someone had felt seen through her pain, and sometimes that was enough to keep going. For nearly 20 minutes after takeoff, Ava sat quietly in her seat, her fingers lightly resting on the armrest, as if anchoring herself to something steady. The cabin remained hushed, filled with that peculiar silence people adopt when they don't know what they're allowed to say. Truth lived in the air, but no one wanted to be the first to disturb it. Outside, the world was soft and golden. Sunset spilled across the wings of the aircraft like warm honey, catching the edges of clouds and turning them into glowing islands in a quiet sky. It should have been a peaceful flight, one of those rare, gentle moments when the world felt far away. But Ava felt none of that peace. Her phone lay in her lap, screen dark. She hadn't turned it back on yet. She didn't know if she wanted to. She could feel the weight of eyes on her, some curious, some sympathetic, some simply unsure, not in a predatory way. More like people watching someone return from a fire, unsure how much of the smoke she still carried. She closed her eyes for a moment. It wasn't the dragging that kept replaying in her mind. It wasn't even Whitney Caldwell's words, sharp and polished like cold metal. It was the feeling. That moment when she had looked into Mason Lee's face and realized he had already decided who she was. No evidence. No questions. Just assumption. That old wound, that silent, familiar wound, throbbed again. The wound of not being believed. The wound of not being seen. She inhaled slowly. Her mother's voice rose again in her memory. "Baby, sometimes the world is blind because it refuses to open its eyes." Ava touched her forehead with 2 fingers, pressing lightly, trying to ease the ache building behind her eyes. As she sat there sinking into herself, Martin Hayes reappeared near her seat. "Miss Morgan," he said in a low tone, "I just wanted to inform you, dinner service will begin shortly. If you'd like to rest or if you want us to skip your course, just let me know. There's absolutely no rush." Ava opened her eyes, meeting his kind gaze. "Thank you, Martin," she said. "I'll have something, maybe later." "Of course." He gave a polite nod and stepped away. Ava reached for the bottle of water again, unscrewing the cap absently. Her throat felt tight. She took a sip, but the coolness didn't quite reach the ache inside her. A few rows back, a young man with glasses, someone who had stayed quiet during the chaos, stood slowly and approached the curtain to first class. He stopped, cleared his throat gently, then asked Martin for permission to speak to Ava. Martin glanced toward her, silently asking if she was comfortable with it. Ava hesitated. Part of her wanted silence, solitude, stillness. Another part, the part her mother had nurtured, knew that people reaching out weren't always intruding. Sometimes they simply needed to say something for their own healing. She nodded. The young man stepped forward, unsure but sincere. "Miss Morgan," he said softly, "I'm sorry to bother you." "You're not bothering me," Ava replied gently. I wanted to say. He took a breath. What happened back there, no one should go through that. And you handled it with so much dignity. I hope you know. People saw that. Ava nodded, moved by the earnestness in his voice. Thank you. Truly. He gave a respectful dip of his head and returned to his seat. After he left, Ava exhaled, leaning back again. She felt a strange mixture: pride, sadness, exhaustion, and something close to vulnerability creeping at the edges. She looked down at her hands again. They were steady, but there was a tremble inside her she couldn't quite hide from herself. Not fear. No, a kind of grief. Grief for the version of herself who still wished that days like this wouldn't happen. Grief for the people who faced them without cameras or witnesses or CEOs barging in to defend them. Then, finally, she reached for her phone. Her thumb hovered over the screen. She unlocked it. A flood of notifications exploded to life. Dozens, hundreds of missed calls, messages, and alerts. Her heart sank. She wasn't ready. But the world clearly wasn't waiting for her to be. She clicked on one message from her general counsel, Taylor Briggs. Taylor Briggs. Call me as soon as you can. Video is everywhere. A second message, from Stephen Ross. Stephen Ross. We're mobilizing legal and communications. You're not alone in this. We're with you. Another from a friend. Ava, I'm so sorry. Are you okay? The whole world is talking about you. Ava closed her eyes again. Not relief this time. Just wait. She opened one of the video links. And there she was. On someone else's phone screen. In someone else's narrative. A story the internet was already pulling apart, dissecting, debating. She watched herself sitting calmly. She watched Whitney Caldwell snap her fingers like Ava was furniture. She watched Ethan Clark reach for her arm. She watched Mason Lee lie. She watched the officers pull her from her seat, and drag her down the aisle. Seeing it through someone else's lens hurt in a different way. It stripped the moment of all the quiet complexities. The beating heart, the silent humiliation, the inner resolve, the hidden trembling. It made her pain consumable. Her stomach twisted. She turned the phone face down. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. Not because the world was watching, but because she didn't know how she felt about being seen so completely. She felt exposed, but also strangely validated, like someone had finally peeled back the curtain on something she had been trying to explain all her life. She ran both hands over her face, letting a soft groan escape, a sound no one else could hear. After a moment, she straightened in her seat again. She whispered under her breath, "This isn't who I wanted to be today." From beside her, the older man in 1C spoke gently. "You handled it better than most of us would have." Ava didn't look at him, she just listened. He continued, his voice a soft murmur. "You didn't humiliate yourself. They did that. You just stood your ground." Ava's lips pressed together. She didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel victorious. She felt human, raw, bruised, and tired. She finally turned her head slightly toward the man. "Did you ever experience something like that?" she asked. He paused, thinking. "Yes," he said quietly. "Different situation, same feeling." Ava waited. He added, "I served in the Air Force for 25 years, but the first time I flew commercial, someone told me I was sitting in the wrong seat because military doesn't sit up front. They assumed I couldn't afford the ticket." He shook his head. "I know that sting." Ava swallowed. There it was again. That quiet thread of shared humanity. The thing that kept people going when the world bruised them. She looked forward again. The aircraft leveled off. The sky darkened gently. Cabin lights shifted to a warm amber glow. Martin began the dinner service, but with a slower pace than usual, giving Ava her space, giving the other passengers time to settle their thoughts. Somewhere behind her, a baby fussed. Somewhere farther back, a couple murmured quietly. Life resumed its ordinary rhythm. But Ava was suspended between who she had been before boarding Flight 91 and who she would be when she stepped off it. Her phone buzzed. Another message. This one from her younger brother, Jordan. "Ava, I'm proud of you. Call me when you land, please." Her chest tightened again. She closed her eyes, letting tears prick lightly at the corners, not falling, but present. The truth was, she wasn't okay. But she was trying to understand the meaning of all this, trying to stay grounded, trying to remember that dignity wasn't a performance, it was a choice. She opened her eyes again and whispered into the quiet cabin, "I won't let this break me." As if hearing the vow, as if responding to her resolve, the plane shuddered gently, just a tremor of turbulence, but enough to remind her that she was still moving, still rising above the world that tried to hold her down. Slowly, she reached for her seatbelt, tightening it, not out of fear, but out of intention. She braced herself not for the flight, but for what waited when the wheels touched the ground. Because Ava knew, with a certainty that made her pulse throb, this was only the beginning. The cabin lights dimmed to a soft evening glow as Liberty Air Flight 91 settled into cruising altitude. A gentle hum filled the space, steady and rhythmic, the kind of sound that usually soothed Ava during long flights. Not tonight. Tonight, the hum felt like background noise to something heavier, an invisible storm building far below them, rising fast, reaching toward her like a tidal wave of eyes, voices, and opinions. Ava glanced down at her phone again. Notifications continued to flicker across the dark screen like tiny flashes of lightning, dozens at a time, then hundreds. Her name, her face, her story. Everywhere. She wasn't sure she had the strength to look. She wasn't sure she had the strength not to. Finally, with a slow breath, she turned the phone over and tapped open one of the trending videos. Instantly, she heard Whitney Caldwell's voice fill the cabin inside her headphones. "Sweetheart, you must be in the wrong seat." Ava's stomach tightened. She fast-forwarded. There she was, calm, still, her voice steady. "My boarding pass says 1A. Then Ethan's panicked tone. Then Mason's lie. Then the officer's rough hands gripping her arms. Ava froze at the part where she was pulled from her seat. Her face didn't show fear, but she remembered the humiliating heat rising in her chest like a burning coal. She closed the video. Her breath shook. It felt different watching it from outside her body, like she was witnessing someone else's pain, someone she desperately wanted to protect. A voice beside her spoke gently. "Ava," said the older man in 1C. "You don't have to watch those right now." She didn't look at him. She just stared at her reflection in the dim window, her eyes soft but tired, her shoulders pulled tight with restrained emotion. "I need to see it," she whispered. "Why?" he asked. "So I understand what the world is seeing." The man sighed. "The world doesn't always see the truth, even when it's staring them in the face." Ava gave a faint, knowing smile. "I know, but sometimes seeing their version helps me prepare for the fallout." He nodded softly, recognizing the weight of her words. She opened another message, this time from a person she had not heard from in years. Her former mentor, Dr. Camille Harper. "Camille, I'm devastated by what happened. Call me when you land. I love you." Ava swallowed hard. Then she saw the next message from Jordan again. "Jordan, people are rallying behind you. You're not alone, sis." The next message was from an unknown number, likely a journalist. Then another, and another. Ava locked the screen and set the phone down. Her pulse throbbed in her ears. She had been preparing for crises her entire professional life. But being the crisis? She wasn't sure anyone ever prepared for that. Martin Hayes approached again, this time accompanied by a younger flight attendant who looked nervous. "Miss Morgan," Martin said slowly, "there's something you should know." Ava sat up straighter. "What is it?" Martin exchanged a quick look with the younger attendant, then cleared his throat. One of the passengers in business class. Well, he recognized you. Ava blinked. Recognized me? Yes, Martin continued. Not from the incident, from your work. The younger attendant added. He said you spoke at a conference he attended last year. Said you were the reason he switched his entire team to Liberty Air. He wanted to pass along a message of support. Ava softened a little. What message? That he's proud of you, the young attendant said. And that he hopes you don't let this break the faith you built in people like him. Ava inhaled slowly, letting the warmth settle inside her chest. She nodded. Thank you, both of you. Martin gave a respectful nod before returning toward the galley. Ava leaned back in her seat again. But this time the silence felt different, less hollow, more conflicted. She reached into her bag and pulled out her journal. A simple, black leather notebook with rough edges and a small pen tucked into the spine. She opened to a clean page. At the top she wrote, "Why does this hurt more than I expected?" She stared at the question for several breaths. Then she began to write, her pen gliding slowly across the paper. Because it wasn't just discrimination. It was disbelief. It was dismissal. It was being treated as invisible in a space I helped build. Her writing was careful, intentional. It hurt because I stayed calm and they still treated me like a threat. It hurt because it reminded me of every quiet battle I've fought alone. It hurt because the world saw it happen, and yet not everyone will understand. She paused. Her hand trembled slightly. Not from fear, from recognition. This moment was too familiar. She remembered being 12 years old, followed by a store clerk who assumed she was stealing. She remembered being 21, mistaken for an intern at her own internship orientation. She remembered being 27, sitting at a boardroom table, only for someone to hand her their empty coffee cup without even looking at her face. She thought she had outgrown that version of the world. But perhaps the world had not outgrown its version of her. She wrote again, "But I am not a victim. I am just tired of being tested by people who refuse to see me." As she finished writing, her chest eased slightly. A breath she didn't realize she'd been holding escaped. The man in 1C glanced at her notebook but didn't try to read it. "Writing helps?" he asked gently. Ava nodded. "It always has." He smiled. "Good. Keep doing what anchors you." She gave a small smile in return. Before she could close the journal, her phone buzzed again, vibrating insistently. Ava hesitated. Then she picked it up. This notification wasn't from a message. It was from a news app. Breaking. Liberty Air's co-founder forcibly removed from first-class seat in viral video. Her face hovered beside the headline. Ava exhaled sharply. Her pulse kicked up again. Her breath shortened. The man in 1C noticed immediately. "Ava?" She shook her head lightly. "I'm okay, just overwhelmed." He nodded slowly. "That's understandable." Ava scrolled down, reading the article. It was brief, incomplete, obviously written quickly to capitalize on the wave of clicks. She skimmed the words. Racially charged confrontation. Executive forcibly removed? Viral outrage. Liberty Air leadership responding. 1. Industry-wide implications. Her hands curled slightly into fists. She didn't want her pain reduced to a headline. She didn't want her identity turned into a spectacle. She didn't want the world to define her moment without knowing her truth. But she also understood something with striking clarity. The story was already bigger than her. She wasn't just the woman in seat 1A anymore. She was a symbol of something larger, something heavier, something she didn't ask for but couldn't walk away from. A tiny tremor shook the cabin as the plane hit a pocket of turbulence. Ava steadied herself with a hand on the armrest. The captain's voice came over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some light turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." His voice was calm, reliable. Safety in the sky. Ava closed her eyes. She wished the world below felt as stable. After a minute, the turbulence eased. Dinner service began quietly. Soft clinks of utensils, Low murmurs. The comforting smell of warm bread. Ava accepted her meal, though she barely touched it. She was staring at her phone again, this time at a comment on one of the shared videos. A simple comment. A short one. But one that struck her harder than anything else. This happens every day. She was just the one who got recorded. Ava's throat tightened. She whispered to herself, God, that's the truth, isn't it? The man in 1C turned slightly toward her. You okay? Ava nodded, though the answer was uncertain. Yes, she said softly, just feeling the weight of things. He gave her a gentle look. Ava, maybe this moment chose you because you could handle it. Ava stared at the reflection in the window. I don't want to be the chosen one, she whispered. The man smiled sadly. Most people who make change never wanted it. They were just strong enough to survive it. Ava swallowed. The words lodged deep inside her. Her phone buzzed again, this time a message from Stephen Ross. Stephen. Ava, brace yourself. This is becoming national news. We'll get ahead of it. You're not facing this alone. She stared at the message for several seconds before replying. Ava. Thank you. I'll be ready. She didn't know if it was true, but she wanted it to be. She closed the message thread and leaned back, letting the hum of the aircraft surround her. She whispered again, softer this time, almost to herself. I won't let this break me. Her reflection stared back, not defeated, not furious, just resolute. A woman rising, despite everything. A woman preparing for a storm waiting on the ground. A woman who would no longer apologize for occupying the space she earned. The lights inside the cabin brightened gently as Liberty Air Flight 91 began its gradual descent toward New York. The captain's voice flowed through the speakers, calm, steady, almost tender. Ladies and gentlemen, we're about 20 minutes from landing at JFK. Weather is clear, and we expect a smooth approach. Please begin preparing for arrival. Ava closed her journal and placed it carefully into her bag. Her hands were steady now, but her chest felt tight, like she was bracing for impact, not from the flight itself, but from everything waiting on the ground. She had been strong for hours, calm in the face of humiliation, graceful under pressure, measured even while the world erupted around her. But strength had a cost, and Ava could feel the bill coming due. Martin approached her seat once more, bending slightly at the waist, a gesture that carried respect without pity. Miss Morgan, he said gently, we've been instructed to allow you to deplane first. Ava nodded. I understand. There will be... Martin hesitated, his lips tightening as if unsure how to say the next words. Media, security, your company representatives. A slow, exhausted breath left her. Of course there would be. Thank you, Ava said, offering a small, weary smile. I'll be ready. But she didn't feel ready. Not even close. The cabin settled into a quiet buzz, seat belts clicking, windows lifting, small bags retrieved, but the energy felt different from any other landing Ava had experienced. People weren't just preparing to arrive. They were preparing to witness something. To witness her. The man in 1C leaned slightly toward her, his voice a low murmur. You don't have to be superhuman, Ava. She met his gaze. You held yourself together under circumstances that would have broken most people, he continued, his eyes gentle. It's okay to feel whatever you're feeling right now. Ava swallowed hard, emotion pressing against her sternum. I'm just tired, she whispered. I know, his voice softened. But tired doesn't make you weak. She looked away, blinking against the sting in her eyes. As the aircraft dipped lower, the skyline of New York appeared, twinkling towers rising against a navy sky. Normally, Ava felt at home seeing those lights. Tonight, they felt like a stage she wasn't sure she wanted to stand on. She tightened her seatbelt as the plane began its final approach. Her heartbeat picked up steadily but insistently. The landing gear lowered. The runways came into view. The engines roared in a controlled crescendo. Then, they touched down. A soft but decisive thud, followed by the sharp inhale of tires gripping concrete. The cabin jolted forward, then steadied. A ripple of quiet relief moved through the passengers. For Ava, there was no relief, only the weight of inevitability. The aircraft slowed, taxiing toward the gate. Her phone buzzed again, then continuously. She didn't look. She didn't want to know what the world was saying in this exact moment. The man in 1C reached out, placing his warm, steady hand over hers for the briefest second. "Whatever's waiting for you out there," he said softly. "You've earned the right to face it on your terms." Ava inhaled deeply. She didn't respond, not because she disagreed, but because she didn't trust her voice not to crack. The plane came to a halt. The soft chime of the seatbelt sign turning off echoed. Before anyone else could stand, Martin stepped forward, lifting his hand to signal the entire cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced gently, "we ask that you remain seated for a moment. Miss Morgan will deplane first, per instruction." No one protested. No one sighed. Every passenger watched quietly, some with sympathy, others with curiosity, most with respect. Ava rose slowly, slipping her bag over her shoulder. Her legs felt steady, but there was a tremor deep within her, hidden, quiet, impossible to show. Martin opened the door. Cold air from the jet bridge swept in. Ava stepped forward, and the world erupted. Flashbulbs exploded like small storms of light. Shouts collided in a chaotic chorus. "Ava! Ava, look this way!" "Miss Morgan, was this racially motivated? Do you plan to sue Liberty Air? Are you okay? What happened on that plane?" Security formed a tight circle around her, guiding her through the jet bridge. Voices echoed off the narrow walls, overlapping questions, frantic footsteps, the whir of cameras. Ava kept her eyes forward. Her breathing quickened despite her efforts to keep it measured. She felt herself slipping, not outwardly, but inward into that space where fear and composure battled for dominance. She whispered internally, "Stay steady. Stay steady." Stephen Ross appeared at the end of the jet bridge, flanked by Taylor Briggs and two senior Liberty Air executives. Stephen's face was pale, genuinely shaken, not by the media, but by what had been done to her. "Ava," he said, stepping forward, voice cracking with sincerity. "I am so sorry." Ava stopped in front of him. Something in her resolve finally cracked. Her voice trembled as she answered, "I trusted our people." Stephen's expression collapsed. "And they failed you." Taylor Briggs stepped closer, his tone calm but furious in a controlled way. "We're mobilizing everything. Legal, public relations, internal reviews. You will not face this alone." Ava nodded, swallowing the swelling emotion in her throat. But as another burst of camera flashes hit her, Ava flinched barely, but enough for Stephen to notice. He placed a gentle hand on her elbow. "We can take you through a private area," he whispered. "Away from the cameras. You don't have to face them right now." Ava looked up at him. Her eyes shined not from tears exactly, but from exhaustion so profound it almost hurt. "I don't want to hide," she said softly. "I just don't want to break in front of them." Stephen's voice steadied. "You won't. Not today." Taylor gestured toward a secure corridor. "This way, Ava." The group moved together, security pushing the crowd back while executives shielded her from the closest cameras. Inside the restricted hallway, the noise dimmed. The flashing lights disappeared. The air grew still. Ava finally exhaled, long and trembling. For the first time since the ordeal began, she let her shoulders slump. Not resignation, not defeat, just honesty. "I'm tired," she whispered. There was no performance left in her. No armor, just a woman, at the end of a long, brutal day. Stephen stepped forward. "Ava," he said gently, "whatever you feel right now, let yourself feel it. You don't need to be strong every second." A tear escaped before she could stop it, a single, silent line down her cheek. Not dramatic, not shattered, Just human. Ava wiped it discreetly, voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want to be a symbol. Taylor met her gaze with steady, grounded calm. Maybe you're not a symbol, he said. Maybe you're a spark. Ava looked at him, breath trembling. A spark for what? For change, he replied softly. Ava's heartbeat steadied a little. Not fully, but enough. Stephen placed a gentle, protective hand on her back. Let's get you home. Ava nodded. As they walked, supported but not carried, she realized something profound. She hadn't broken. She had bent. She had trembled. She had shaken. But she was still standing. And maybe that was enough for now. New York at night had always carried a certain electricity, a sense of motion, ambition, and noise woven into the very concrete of the streets. But tonight, as Ava Morgan stepped out of the secure corridor and into the black SUV waiting outside Terminal 4, she felt none of that familiar energy. Only weight. Heavy, invisible, pressing hard against her ribs. Stephen Ross held the door open as she climbed in, Taylor following close behind. Security vehicles lined up behind them in silent formation. The moment her door shut, the chaos of the airport fell away, replaced with the muffled calm of the car's insulated interior. Ava leaned her head back against the seat, closing her eyes as the SUV pulled away from curbside. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Stephen exhaled, long and slow. Ava, this is bad. His voice was quiet, almost apologetic. Ava opened her eyes. How bad? Taylor unlocked his tablet, the screen brightening the interior with harsh, white-blue light. Every major outlet has picked it up, he said. CNN, NBC, Fox, New York Times, AP News. Social media is on fire. 20 million views in 3 hours. Ava closed her eyes again. 20 million. That number felt unreal. People are angry, Stephen added, outraged. They're demanding accountability. They're calling it one of the worst corporate discrimination scandals in the last decade. A hollow ache settled in Ava's chest. She whispered, almost to herself, I didn't want this to be a scandal. Taylor softened his tone. You didn't create the scandal, Ava. They did. She shook her head slowly. Still, millions of people watched me get dragged out of a seat I paid for, a seat I helped design. Taylor set the tablet aside. You didn't lose dignity, he said firmly. The people who tried to take it from you, they lost theirs. The SUV turned onto the highway, the lights of Manhattan glowing in the distance like 1,000 restless eyes. Ava rested her hand on the window. She could feel herself fracturing inside quietly, in small pieces no one could see. The composure she'd fought to maintain all day was thinning, stretched too far across too much pain. Where are we going? Ava asked softly. To your apartment, Stephen said. Security is already there, media too. We'll get you through the back entrance. Ava sighed. I don't want camera crews outside my home. I know, Stephen replied, but we can't control where the press shows up. All we can do is protect your space as much as possible. Ava looked at her hands calm, steady hands that had once carried her through investor meetings, product launches, board negotiations. Tonight, they trembled, just slightly. Do you want to stay somewhere else? Stephen asked gently. A hotel? My place? A secure company property? Ava shook her head. No. I want to go home. I need something familiar. Stephen nodded. The car fell silent again. Taylor watched her quietly. He could see the exhaustion in her posture, the emotional erosion at the edges. Ava, he said softly, you don't have to talk right now. Just breathe. We'll handle the logistics. Ava nodded again, grateful. But breathing was harder than it sounded. Outside her window, the skyline grew closer. And with it, reality. The interviews, the statements, the corporate fallout, the public's expectations, the personal wounds she hadn't allowed herself to feel yet. It all pressed into her chest. Suddenly, Her phone vibrated in her hand. She glanced at the screen. Jordan Morgan. Are you home yet? Want me to come over? For the first time in hours, Ava's lips lifted into a tiny, exhausted smile. She typed back, Ava. Not yet. Almost. I'll let you know. She locked her phone again, holding it loosely between her fingers. Stephen glanced over. Your brother? Ava nodded. He worries. Stephen looked forward again. He should, he murmured. Today was brutal. Ava turned her face toward the window. I didn't break, she whispered. I thought I would, but I didn't. Taylor's tone warmed. You were stronger than anyone had the right to expect. Ava pressed her palm to her chest. Then why do I feel like I'm going to fall apart now? Neither man answered. Not because they didn't know, but because they understood. Strength is easiest when survival instincts take over. It's when the danger passes that the body collapses. The SUV slowed as it approached her building. Security lights illuminated a back entrance, guarded by 2 Liberty Air security officers in black jackets. No cameras here. No reporters. Just quiet. The car stopped. Stephen turned to her. Ava, before you go inside, there's something you need to decide. Ava looked at him, weary. What? Do we speak tomorrow? Or tonight? Ava blinked. Speak about what? Taylor opened his tablet again. The press statement, he said calmly. The internal memo to employees, the disciplinary actions, the board's emergency meeting, everything that goes into the corporate response. Ava rubbed her temples. Tonight? She whispered. After all this? Stephen's smile was sympathetic but firm. The world won't wait for morning. Ava's throat tightened. She felt suddenly overwhelmed, wave after wave crashing over her until she struggled to keep her footing. Can it wait? She asked, her voice small. Just a few hours? I need to breathe. Taylor's gaze softened. Of course it can wait. Stephen nodded. You're allowed to be human, Ava. But Ava shook her head. No. I'm allowed to be tired, but I'm also responsible. She inhaled shallow, shaky. I'll write the statement tonight, after I shower, after I sit down for a minute. Stephen touched her shoulder gently. You don't have to write it alone. Ava looked at them, these 2 men who had stood with her through the darkest hours of her career. I know, she said quietly, but I need my words, not a document crafted by a PR team. This happened to me. The response has to come from my voice. Neither argued. Ava reached for the door handle. Her reflection in the window stared back, tired eyes, strong jaw, shoulders drawn in tight against the pressure. She didn't look like a symbol, or a warrior, or a victim. She looked like a woman trying to survive something she hadn't asked for. She stepped out of the car into the quiet, cold air of the service entrance. Her steps were slow, almost delicate. Stephen followed behind her. Ava, he said softly. She paused, turning slightly. You don't have to be the strongest person in the room tonight. Ava gave a small, broken smile. Yes, she whispered. I do. Then she walked inside. The hallway was dim and warm. Her heels clicked lightly against the floor. She held her bag close to her body. As soon as her apartment door shut behind her softly, gently, Ava let her back slide down the wall until she sank to the floor. And for the first time all day, she cried. Not loud, not messy, just soft, shaking tears that fell into her hands like small pieces of the strength she had carried for too long. She cried for the humiliation, for the disbelief, for the invisible wounds reopened, for the responsibility now resting entirely on her shoulders. She cried for the girl she had been, and the woman she had become. And when the tears finally slowed, Ava whispered into the quiet room, I'm still here. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't victory. It was survival. And for now, that was enough. Morning came slowly. Not with the warm promise of a sunrise, but with a muted gray spilling through Ava Morgan's apartment windows. The city outside was already awake: cars, horns, distant voices, but inside her living room, everything felt still. Ava sat at her kitchen counter, wrapped in a soft robe, hands curled around a mug of coffee she hadn't actually taken a sip of. She'd slept maybe 2 hours light, fractured sleep that felt more like drifting in and out of consciousness. Her eyes were puffy, her chest felt tight, but she was upright. She was still here. The quiet of her apartment felt foreign, almost too gentle for the kind of noise her life had become overnight. Her phone buzzed again. Another headline, another notification, another avalanche of opinions. She turned the phone face down. She needed a moment before the world reached her again. A soft knock came at the door. Ava froze, body instinctually tensing. Reporters? Cameras? Noise? "Hey," came Jordan's voice. "It's me." Ava released a breath she didn't know she was holding and opened the door. Her younger brother stepped inside, warm and grounded, carrying a small paper bag. "I brought breakfast," Jordan said gently. "The kind with the annoying chia seeds you pretend not to like." His attempt at humor cracked the heaviness around her chest just a little. Ava let out a soft laugh. "Thank you." Jordan studied her face, careful not to overwhelm, but steady enough to let her know he wasn't leaving. "You look tired," he said softly. "I am tired," Ava replied. "Everything feels heavier than it should." Jordan squeezed her shoulder. "That's because you carried the whole damn day yesterday on your back." Ava allowed herself a small smile. Jordan set the food down and turned serious. "Have you seen the numbers?" Ava sighed. "No, and I don't want to." Jordan nodded. "Fair. Just know, the world is on your side. People are marching, protesting, calling out Liberty Air, sharing stories of things that happened to them." Ava's breath stilled. "Stories?" Jordan nodded again. "It's not just about you anymore." She felt both humbled and overwhelmed. This wasn't what she wanted, but maybe it was what needed to happen. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed. This time it was Stephen Ross. Ava inhaled deeply and answered. "Stephen." "Ava, good morning," he said, voice steady but tense. "The board wants to meet today." Ava blinked. "Today?" "Yes. They want you there, in person." Her pulse quickened. She wasn't ready for a room full of executives deciding how to manage the scandal. She wasn't ready to be analyzed, dissected, sympathized with, or debated. But she also understood something deeply. If she didn't stand in that room, someone else would speak for her. And she wasn't willing to let her story, her experience, or her pain be rewritten by people who hadn't lived it. She straightened slightly. "What time?" she asked. "In 2 hours. I'll be there." She hung up. Jordan stepped closer. "You sure you're up for that?" Ava let her hand rest on the counter, grounding herself. "No," she said honestly. "But I've been unprepared for a lot of things in my life. I survived those. I'll survive this." Jordan nodded with quiet pride. "I'll drive you," he offered. Ava touched his arm. "Thank you." 2 hours later, Ava walked into Liberty Air headquarters through a private entrance. The building's polished floors reflected her image back at her strong posture, calm steps, steady breathing. Yet inside, she felt a familiar flutter of nerves. Security escorted her to the 32nd floor. Outside the boardroom, Stephen and Taylor waited. Stephen stepped forward. "Ava, I just want you to know, everyone in that room is on your side." Ava lifted her chin. "Good, because I'm not here for sympathy. I'm here for accountability." Taylor smiled with approval. "Let's go in." The boardroom doors opened. Every director rose to their feet as Ava entered. Respect. Not performance, genuine respect. She took her seat. Taylor sat beside her. Stephen stood at the head of the table. The meeting began. The board chair, a composed woman in her 60s, looked at Ava with a softness that surprised her. "Miss Morgan," she said gently, "before we proceed, we want you to know. What happened to you was unacceptable. We stand with you. Ava nodded. Thank you, the chair continued. But this moment requires clarity, strength, and decisive action. We need your leadership. Ava folded her hands in front of her. I'm ready. One director leaned forward. Ava, what do you want to see happen? To the staff, to the systems, to the culture? Ava inhaled slowly. This was her moment not to punish, but to build. I want change, she said simply. Real change, not slogans, not statements. Structural change. She paused, letting the weight settle. And I want to lead it. The room stilled. One of the older directors raised his brows. Lead it? Ava nodded firmly. Yes. The entire reform, top to bottom. From hiring practices to training to passenger policies. I want authority over all culture and customer experience restructuring. Stephen leaned forward, eyes bright with support. Ava's proposal is strong, strategic, necessary. Another director added, what you experienced wasn't just an incident, it was a symptom. Ava nodded. And I intend to treat the disease, not the flare-up. The board murmured approval. Another director asked, what would you call this initiative? Ava didn't hesitate. The Morgan Accord, she said softly but confidently. A new standard for fairness, safety, and dignity in travel. The room absorbed the name. It carried weight, history, vision. The chair tapped her pen lightly. Well, Miss Morgan, I think you've just given this company exactly what it needs. The vote was unanimous. The Morgan Accord was approved. Ava Morgan, once dragged from her seat, was now placed at the helm of the largest cultural overhaul in the company's history. After the meeting, Stephen walked her to the elevator. You were brilliant in there, he said gently. I wasn't trying to be brilliant, Ava replied. I was trying to be honest. Stephen smiled. Sometimes the strongest thing a leader can do is tell the truth plainly. Ava stepped into the elevator. Before the doors closed, Stephen added, I'm proud of you. Ava's voice softened. I'm learning to be proud of myself too. Back at her apartment that evening, Ava sat on the couch with Jordan, box of takeout between them. For the first time since the incident, she felt her chest loosen. Just a little. Just enough to take a full breath. Jordan nudged her. You know, one day this is going to be a story people tell to inspire others. Ava laughed quietly. I didn't want to inspire anyone. I just wanted a quiet flight. Jordan smirked. Yeah, well, life had other plans. Ava leaned her head back against the couch. She looked out at the city alive, restless, resilient, just like her. I won't let this break me, she whispered again. Jordan looked at her, eyes warm. It won't, he said simply. Because you're built from different stuff. Ava looked down at her hands. These hands had been pulled, held, gripped by strangers. But they were still steady, still capable, still hers. She closed her eyes. In the quiet of her living room, she felt something shift. Not victory, not triumph. Healing, slow, imperfect, but real. Tomorrow the work would begin. The Morgan Accord, the rebuilding, the long road ahead. But tonight, Ava Morgan rested. Not because she was done fighting, but because she finally understood. She wasn't fighting alone, and she never would be again. Ava Morgan's story reminds us of a lesson that seems old, but never ceases to be true. How a person is treated in times of weakness can reveal the true character of those around them. Ava, a successful, strong woman, but still the subject of invisible prejudice, was pulled from her seat simply because people decided that she did not belong there. The greatest pain in life is not when we are hurt by strangers, but when we realize that society still has colored glasses that make people look at each other with suspicion before looking at each other with respect. The big lesson here is, status, education, or success cannot protect anyone from prejudice. Only courage, self-respect, and how we confront injustice can. Ava doesn't take revenge. She makes amends. Not just for herself, but for those who come after her. So they don't have to suffer what she suffered. For older audiences, perhaps everyone has experienced the feeling of being overlooked, being hastily judged. This story hopes to touch that memory, not to rekindle sadness, but to remind us that just one person who dares to stand up can change an entire system. Thank you for staying until the end of the story. If you find it meaningful, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel to spread more healing and humane stories to more people.